Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I had the honor of welcoming Piper Huguley, professor of literature at Clark Atlanta University, to discuss her book, By Her Own Design. The novel is a fictional account of real-life fashion designer Ann Lowe and traces Lowe's life, talent, and accomplishments in the backdrop of living during an era of segregation and prejudice. Our conversation covers everything from the book to what adding voices to historical narratives can mean for the future of history. We recorded over Zoom, so I'm inserting my typical sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the interview. Hey everyone, with me today is Piper Huguley. She is a historical fiction writer who recently wrote By Her Own Design, telling the inspiring story of Ann Lowe, the Black fashion designer who crafted former First Lady Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress. And this book will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Piper.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. So let's dive right on in. On the surface, this is a book about a seamstress. However, there is so much more beneath the surface. So, how would you describe this book to someone new?
Well, first of all, one of the ongoing sort of arguments about the book is that Ann Lowe was more than a seamstress. She was a fashion designer of custom clothing, bespoke clothing for the high elite women in the social register and beyond. Anybody who had lots and lots of money, they formed her clientele. And in her 1964 appearance on the Mike Douglas show, she confirms this to say that part of her journey, her life's journey, was to prove that, as she put it in the language of the day, a Negro could be a fashion designer. So that's how I consider her. That's what I put forward in the book in terms of who she was and how she did things in terms of her life. She started out as someone who was an inheritor of a sewing talent from 3 generations back in terms of the women of her family and what they did after the Civil War, before and during the course of the family's enslavement in Alabama. A long line of women with an extraordinary talent that Ann Lowe took it to another level.
And how did you come to write historical fiction?
Well, this was what I call part 2, of my journey. I started out writing historical romance or bringing forward a particularly different viewpoint of historical romance, one that I call a more realistic, a little grittier perspective than the fantastical perspective that historical romance can sometimes go into. That was 1.0. This is 2.0, where I'm taking up the stories of unsung, unheralded Black women like Ann Lowe in the genre of what is known as biographical historical fiction. So that is what this particular story is all about.
And given that it is about Ann Lowe, what about this woman's story stood out to you as needing to be told?
Her extreme determination and focus in terms of what it was that she was trying to do with her life's work, and relentless insistence on her dignity. Several things. Several people think of the story in one way. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, I don't know anything about sewing or like sewing," but to me, her story, as I try to portray it in the book, is for anyone who has a dream of any kind. And this was this was the central concern of her life, that she had a particular dream to be this fashion designer, an artist, particular kind of art that is not given artistic consideration by the larger society, but certainly is that, and that she proved it. Is just sort of it's just sort of the proof is that the works of her hands, as I call them, the gowns and the dresses, are in museums.
Yeah.
They're not in people's closets. They are in museums because of the depth of her craft was so intricate that that's where they are, and that's where they were up to the earlier this month at the Winter Fair in Delaware, where they had pulled together 40 of those gowns from collections all over the country to exhibit in a museum space to give that kind of credit and confirmation of her as an artist.
Yeah, the story begins when, it initially starts kind of in the contemporary 1960s and then kind of looks back and really you do a wonderful job of kind of tracing. It was a lifelong dream. And I think something that might connect with readers too is it was a lifelong struggle and pursuit and required perseverance and some strength of character that I thought was very well done and well crafted throughout the novel.
Thank you. Yes, that is certainly true. Yes, and she's an example to us all, in terms of when you might want to give up and things look rough on the first day.
There's another option.
Yeah.
And so when coming to the table and writing about a real person, how do you balance that fact and fiction?
Well, given that this particular real person is someone who was born in Jim Crow, Alabama, coming to the table, I already know that there are certain aspects of her life that are not going to be documented by the historical record because of those limitations. So there are certain aspects of that that have to be created, particularly in terms of her early years. The thing about Ann Lowe that was more of a benefit is that because of the work that she did in terms of who she worked for, whatever, is that for a Black woman of her time period, there's more that exists in terms of newspaper interviews, accounts, magazine interviews, accounts. The infamous 1964 Mike Douglas interview that exists to assist with creating what I call the connections between the tent poles of fact in her life, the things that we do know, and then using fiction to create what I call plausible scenarios and circumstances to connect those tent poles of fact to create the story. So in terms of her early years, though, as I said, where you really don't have much to go on, I had a couple of serendipitous connections in that my paternal great-grandmother was born 2 counties over in Alabama. From growing up from family stories, I knew what her early years as a young girl looked like, as well as my scholarship for Zora Neale Hurston, who everybody thinks of Zora Neale Hurston as a Florida author, but she, in fact, was born in Alabama, another 2 counties over in the other direction from Ann Lowe. So I already came to her story knowing a certain kind of thing about her early years that I could then build upon and develop and take those other aspects of her life that are known from newspaper articles, magazine articles, and her video and create a story.
Yeah. And you've kind of touched on this in your prior answer, but I am curious, how do you do this research process and how do you kind of figure out, okay, that's a good detail and a good fact, but the story would work much better if I did this. How does that research look?
Yeah, and that's again, part of the things that I was counting on were those accounts. A lot of it, or some of it, had been collected up for me in a thesis by Margaret Powell, the textile scholar who I dedicated the book to, because had she not written that thesis and had collected up that research, it would have been a much more difficult task to create a story from that. Unfortunately, Margaret Powell died at 43 or 44, something like that, of breast cancer, but this was her scholarship, and I really wanted to pay tribute to her work in a way, the way that I could as a novelist, in terms of writing a historical fiction project. But there is, as part of the aspects of this genre known as biographical historical fiction, one of the expectations of it is to include an author's note in the back, where the author writes it could be sometimes just 1 or 2 pages long. In some cases of some books, it's been up to 20 pages long. An author's note explaining just what was realized and what wasn't, sort of walking through the choices that I made in regards to some of the aspects of her story. One of them being the fact that, in 1953, there was a horrific accident at her studio that caused Jacqueline Bouvier's gown to be destroyed, and many of the bridesmaids' gowns to be destroyed scant days before the wedding. That's fact. The fiction comes in, given newspaper chronicles and what she spoke about on the Mike Douglas show, that she said that there was a party upstairs above the studio and they let the bathtub run too long. And it caved in the ceiling, causing that accident. But as a fiction writer, that's not dramatic enough. It's not engaging enough. So instead, I create a whodunit kind of scenario to say someone purposefully did the caving in or the breaking of a pipe in her studio to cause the accident, that then allows me as a novelist to take the walk through her life, so that as the reader's reading the pages, they can walk along with Anne to try to figure out, who would have done something like that? So horrific, right just before her most infamous commission.
And what is something that surprised you during crafting this book?
What unfortunately surprised me is that several of the incidents that created for the purposes of the story, that in real life were actually worse. Yeah. That, there is, it's one of these things. I lurk a lot in a lot of Facebook groups of historical fiction readers, because I am a historical fiction reader. So, that has changed certainly, or whatever, but it does kind of give me some insight into what readers expect or whatever. One of the ongoing things about historical fiction is it can't be kind of a gloomy kind of genre. It's, not like a happy kind of genre for sure. And so there is a balance there as well, in terms of the incidents that she did have to overcome, the obstacles that she did have to overcome, from the early years of her life to her latest years. But that to know that things were actually worse than that, didn't surprise me, but it did sadden me.
Yeah.
When you are dealing with a subject for so long, and you're reading about them, and you have certain feelings for them or whatever. Like I said, I talk about myself in some ways as having a soul of asbestos, in terms of being able to teach some of the horrors of Black history and in the literature that I talk about to my students, etc. But it's still, since the notion of a novel is to create an emotional connection with one. So knowing that there were indignities that she had to put up with that did not make it to the page, that's a toughie.
Yeah. Well, I imagine too, writing about that time period and that area of the country is kind of unfortunately, it invites itself to read or learn about the most unbecoming pieces of our past.
Yes, that's true. And as I said, I teach that on the regular in terms of other things, but it just seems like having had this fomented this connection with Ann Lowe, and as someone did point out to me, you're going to have to talk about her for the rest of your life. I'm fine with that. That's why I chose her to write about her. No problem. But yeah, it's hurtful
Yeah.
in terms of that. And kind of like I said, in a way that when I talk about other aspects of Black history for my students prior to teaching novels or stories or poetry or whatever, that it hits a little different coming at it from this particular perspective.
And I'm curious, how do you protect yourself as a writer, knowing that you're going to come across probably some pretty harrowing stories? And it's all in the name of research, yes, but it's also can be mentally exhausting and challenging. And again, as you were saying, having that connection with your character, and I assume having some sort of protective feelings of her. How do you protect yourself and when you kind of are reading these things?
Well, as I said, I think that's one of the things. Maybe this is kind of an assumption that I'm making about who it is that gets to tell these stories or whatever. But I I feel as if I've been chosen to tell these stories in a certain kind of way, and that people need to know about this very important woman. They need to know about her at least in February and March, but hopefully beyond that.
Right.
Even today, when we talk about fashion designers, can't really like come up or name. And I remember back in the 80s, because I'm that old, hearing about, oh, these Black fashion designers that are coming out of New York, they were always Black men.
Mm.
Hearing about a woman, a Black woman as a fashion designer, when we name women fashion designers, we can name them on one hand. It seems as if the industry is captured by white men, as a lot of other entities are. And so it's important for people to know about this, and that drive in terms of letting people know about who she was or whatever, for me, supersedes everything else in terms of it. I'm fine, but it's just to say that that matters more to me.
And so I imagine, as writer of historical fiction, you had to have some sort of love for history. So what sparked your love of history?
Yeah, and it took me a long time to realize that, even in terms of this notion of, like I said, I didn't want to sound conceited or arrogant, just that I've chosen to write these stories or whatever, because it took me quite a while to come to that. Even as I look back over my life and realize things like, why was I asking my mother to sew me costumes for Halloween as a pilgrim and as Betsy Ross? And here I was Laura Ingalls Wilder, and that she created even a sunbonnet for me, and it had to be, I perched it on my little afro and made sure to tie it down real tight because it would pop up off of my afro if I hadn't tied down my sunbonnet, like, and she didn't laugh at me or make like, why do you want to do that? Anything crazy like that or whatever. So it has been a long-standing interest that I've had in it. It's been something that, like I said, even when I wasn't called upon to do things or in response in school, I would create projects for myself, which is how I came first to know about Ann Lowe. Was my created research project one summer during my teenage years of the Kennedys. I sort of knew in the back of my mind about her as, like I said, who were the Black people affiliated with the Kennedys. I knew about her in that way, but didn't come to find out her life story, the incredible journey that she had, until much more recently. Even more recently, the fact and the realization, I think it was in graduate school, pointedly, where, and this is where these things come up. They don't come up in historical study in K through 12, or like I said, if you have it during your undergraduate years, you have to choose it in college. But the fact that a particular historical narrative has been curated for the benefit of just what people consider to be historical knowledge that is incomplete.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it's wrong. I usually people, so when you talk about this whole notion of what Time Magazine called the history wars
Mm-hmm.
that's going on, it's incomplete. It is a narrative that has been perpetuated only by certain groups of people. And only when you get more scholars coming into the academy of varying genders and races are you going to get a more complete picture of the history. And yet, this narrative has been imparted to people in their K through 12 years, I think, most pointedly, as some kind of gospel truth that cannot be interfered or messed with in any particular kind of way. And like I said, I don't think Time Magazine, when they did have that cover, was being facetious. It has been, as of late, a war of ideas in terms of opening up that narrative and saying these other voices have a different viewpoint, not a bad viewpoint, but a different viewpoint of how these events, situations, etc., occurred. And you can't say that you have a complete history without including those perspectives as well. So, like I said, when I was a little kid, I always had this particular interest in it. In terms of part of it, I guess, is I was also gifted with great parents who encouraged that. But when I said when I got to graduate school and found out all of this other stuff that had been, I don't, some people say, oh, how dare they keep it from me or whatever. I don't know if it's that. It's just that the narrative is written by winners, and that's how they tell the story. Is the people who have the most money, have the most means, have fought and won the wars. But there's another side. There's always other sides to historical narrative. And for me, that's this as of this year, this 10-year journey I've been on has been about imparting that another portion of that narrative.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think your book helps I kind of identify or really helps connect is the idea of making history popular and for the public, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the goals of this show is to really get people to be interested and to ask their own questions and to, turn off the episode and go and do some deep dives of research, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I wanted to have you on, is because I think historical fiction done well, which this one is, it helps not only entertain you and get you walking through the past and putting you in the lives and the shoes of someone else that you might not recognize, who might have different life experience. But hopefully when they close the book, because I know I did, I have more questions and want to know more, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one of the contributions that you're making to public history, in a sense, through kind of a different, quote unquote, different way of getting people interested.
Yes, I appreciate that, because that's the intention of historical fiction. That's the intention of the author's note. The author's note has those other resources listed there. Here's this website I used, or these books that I used, or whatever. Because that's, the entire point is that you should have, hopefully, you're going to go and find out more about whatever it was that you had finished reading about. So yes, that's all intentional. It's intentional on my part as well to make the text accessible. I, as a literature professor, one thing that I have noticed in the many years that I have been doing it is a decline in the reading skills of my students who come to the classroom. And that this is it's not just, and I was talking about this to a professor the other day who seemingly didn't realize it, not just in certain pockets of our society or with certain people. This is everyone, whereby the skills of reading are being lost. And so part of the way that I sought to structure the book, the language that I use, and everything was to attempt to make it as accessible as possible for the widest possible audience to approach it and read it and to be able to understand what was being imparted as part of that. So that was all part of the intention that I had for this book. So I'm glad that was successful.
And while we're still talking about history, what's your favorite period in history?
For me, my whole thing is like, this is what I specialize in, what author Beverly Jenkins called from Civil War to Civil Rights, sort of post 1865 to the early 1960s, sort of kind of thing. It's a particular period of time that we don't see as many stories or narratives about. And so this is one of the reasons why, when I was deciding what to specialize in, what to think about or whatever, was really my intention to focus on that particular perspective in history. And sometimes people ask like the question of us historical fiction authors, would you time travel? Absolutely not. I like time travel stories, but me personally, no, thank you. About it, I think, is part of it. Other people who like to look at time travel stories and think, "Oh, isn't that romantic?" or the clothes what they're wearing. Nobody is thinking about there's no air conditioning and the food they're eating is rancid, and and that dude who looks so cute or whatever, he's not showering frequently. I mean, there's all of these other things that make it kind of like.
There are some benefits to the common comforts of where we're at.
It's even with everything that is happening now or society or whatever, I'm fine being in 2024. In terms, so.
All right, so let's take us behind the curtain a little bit. What does your writing process look like?
Well, in terms of a story like this, it really does start with the research and trying to find as many of those tent poles of fact and really beginning to create first a narrative. As I said, it has to be a dramatic narrative that moves organically in that way, because life as it exists, it tends to be more episodic in nature, and that's not the way in which a novel would be constructed. So this notion of what would be the dramatic narrative or the through line is one of the first organizing concerns. But also to find those places or those incidents that would provide a revelation of the person, the character that's being written about as part of the facts. And again, thinking about how a story gets built around those things. I guess we haven't really talked about the sobering early fact about Ann Lowe's life is that she most likely had engaged in a marriage when she was extremely young. 12 is thought the age. And later grown up, Ann Lowe had the feeling towards it of trying to hide it. Or because I think a number of, and there's a particular scene in the book where a client of hers expresses disgust regarding it. There's a certain amount of a ways in which people would look down upon such a phenomenon, even as I've spoken to many book clubs and gearing up now, coming up into February and March, speaking to many book clubs about such an entity. And inevitably, no matter what the racial composition is or whatever, someone will say, oh, yes, my grandmother was 13, my grandmother was 14 or 15, whatever. So this is, like I said, another one of those unsettling, uneasy parts of our history. The tentpole of fact is that she became Arthur's mother when she was 15, which of course doesn't preclude the fact that she didn't have to be married to his father or whatever, but a couple of things in terms of that 1910 census record that I talk about in the author's note, where she's noted as being 21, which, given her birth, what the circumstances of her birth, is not correct. That her husband Lee, who I call a pedophile, most likely lied to the census taker about that. When a white census taker comes to your door and starts asking these questions, how do you respond, right? That particular aspect. So taking those two things and thinking about, okay, well, and the fact that in the 1910 census record, it lists her husband as a tailor. And it says, or she was known to say later on in interviews, that when she would talk about who her first husband was, she spoke about how he didn't want her to sew. And so one of my created aspects of that was he didn't want her to sew the things that she wanted to sew, but instead used what was clearly her developing skill set that she had from being a child, creating or sewing flowers from scraps that her mother and grandmother would throw away from the clothes that they were sewing. That he would use her skills for his own ends. In a certain kind of aspect, in fact, almost enslaving her for his own ends. So some of that required me to think about what that early portion of her life would look like. And her escape, which she, sort of would talk about in interviews in that kind of almost fanciful kind of way, how I escaped the clutches of this horrific pedophile Lee Cohen was. Yeah, that I think for her was really meant to be the beginning of the exciting part of her life, how I escaped. I tried to create it that way too.
Yeah.
In terms of that, even though, again, some of the ways in which Ann Lowe was, she's a little feistier than I might have given her some credit for. And Josephine Lee approaches her in the Dothan, Alabama department store. It's a scene where, given my previous research and when I first found out about it, made me nervous. If you are a Black woman in Jim Crow South and you're dressed too well, that could be a problem. And so that's one of the reasons why when I constructed the scene, I had her not speak up and say that she sewed the outfit, even as she herself was not known to be a flashy dresser, but clearly Josephine Lee had a good eye. She could see, oh, what she's wearing is well made. And so I would want to know where that clothing came from. But in real life, Ann Lowe told her, I did it. So yeah, there's certain things like that, like I said, she just, she had a certain kind of belief in her ability.
Yeah.
She knew. And as I said, she knew. And my thoughts about her mother and grandmother knowing, yes, she made this horrendous mistake, but that it shouldn't stop her from doing things like I said, those two women could never have imagined the places that she went, even in spite of all of the difficulties that she had and what she put up with. They could never have imagined that, but they imagined something greater for her. They just didn't know what it looked like, essentially.
Yeah. And you touched on this earlier in the interview, but just curious, what are you hoping people take away from the book? Is there anything we talked about, the never giving up and that perseverance and that strength, but is there anything else as readers put the book away, you hope they walk away with?
Yeah, well, beyond that, like I said, my hope is that, we can start having like some, like, I don't know, start talk to my students about. Remember when you're a little kid and it's time to decorate the classroom for Black History Month, and you get all these big heads and you hang them up to say these are the people you commemorate. And this is one of the things in terms of the shifting aspects of including more of this history. And my students have said it several times. Somebody just said it to me the other day. They always teach you the same people. Mm-hmm. Let's weave in people like Ann Lowe in terms of talking about the history. That's all, I think, part of this expanding this historical narrative and looking more closely at other people's accomplishments and the things that they did to be more inclusive beyond, as my students said, they always talk about the same people. But even as I told my student, yeah, they may talk about the same people, but they don't always talk about their complete life story in the same way. And I always test that with them. They get my unscientific scientific measurements to say, yes, we all know Rosa Parks sat down on the bus, she got tired, blah, blah, blah. Did you know they purposely selected her to do that? Did you know why they purposely selected her to do that? Did you know who else had done that particular same thing, but they didn't want her to be the face of it? All of that stuff, and that's what I mean. Is like to say, they say we know about the same people. No, you really don't, because the narrative that you're taught is one that is carefully created and for a purposeful end. An old lady, she wasn't that old.
As someone who's closer to her age than I care to admit, she was not that old. So. And so kind of along the stream of knowing more of the under-celebrated or underwritten or understudied women and men from history, who do you have a list in mind that you can share of people that yep, I'm gonna get to a book about you someday?
I'm hopeful of certain people. There are certain people that I would like to do that I hopefully their family members will see these works and hopefully think me worthy of, Yeah, the nature for biographical historical fiction is if someone is a public figure, you don't necessarily need someone's permission, but it sort of comes from an aspect of respecting a particular person's circumstance and situation. And sometimes when you see the family as being incredibly active and or protective of that legacy, it would be nice to have their blessing in terms of those particular aspects. Not one pointedly that I always talk about and think about is Ida Wells Barnett. For instance, that I would love to be able to write a novel about her, but her great-granddaughters are very protective of her legacy, etc. So I hope, down the road, we'll see. I do have other people in mind, but there are a lot of other people who are also doing this work. I say the more the merrier in terms of it, but one of the other aspects of it is that publishing is a business. And that these books have to sell well in order for more of them to see the light of day. So that, for me right now, is sort of the singular focus is hopefully getting the word spread, hopefully having the means to market and publicize these stories so that they can sell more, so that there can be more of these stories brought to light.
And where should people go to learn more about you and your work?
My website is piperhuguley.com. I'm on social media, on Facebook with Piper G. Huguley. Twitter is at Piper Huguley. I'm still there. Instagram is Piper_Huguley.
And do you have another project in the pipeline that you can share about?
Well, it's actually coming on April 2nd. So it's called American Daughters, and it is about the secret interracial friendship between the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, Alice, and the daughter of Booker T. Washington, Portia. or as I like to think about it in my mind, the white princess and the black princess of America were friends. Their friendship, which lasted approximately three quarters of the 20th century, first came about in the wake of that very famous time when poor TR thought he was going to just have Booker Washington over for dinner. The one just after he gets to be president on the McKinley assassination. So he was newly come to being president and I guess didn't realize or know that this would be the first time that a Black man had walked through the front doors of the White House in order to have a meal, and the country lost its mind over it. And that a week later, there was an event where up in Connecticut, where TR was presenting, or Booker T. Washington was going to give a speech later in the day, and that their rebellious teenage daughters were in the background there as well. And they had cartoons of Booker T. Washington making inappropriate advances to Alice Roosevelt, and she was not even there yet because her father had not brought her down from where she had been staying with family, probably because he was afraid to. I mean, and that's the thing with Alice Roosevelt, with people who know about her historically, is about how feisty and nonconformist and all of that she was. But in all of the narratives that I've ever seen about Alice, nobody ever bothered to ask why. What was making her do the things where her father would say, I could either run the country or I can control Alice, but I cannot possibly do both. Little quirky things that, she did, of carrying a snake in her reticule and, why was she doing all of those things? So for me, the Alice side of this story is about that, and the fact that she had this compatriot in her life of a young Black woman who's also the daughter of a famed statesman, and the heavy expectations of that. When daddy is incredibly famous and well known, who's going to be the husband that you're going to find, who's going to be able to marry you and keep you? Which was the concerns of young women in 1901. In the manner that you're accustomed. And, when you have that, and then you find out that those dudes are kind of disappointing, and you have kids, or you have, you don't have a child, which was part of Alice's situation. How do you find your way out of that? So it's this parallel story, yes, of one Black woman, one white woman who managed to maintain and to the bonds of friendship that brought them together. In terms of that similarity, they also both lost their mothers at painstakingly early ages, which both marked them, as well as the stepmothers who come in and resent them highly in terms of that. So I'll call it, the publisher did actually call it American Daughters. But this whole notion of these two women and what connects them. The book only goes to 1930, but it's enough in terms of the early years of showing their interconnectedness with one another and why.
And as we wrap up, is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you'd like future readers to know?
Well, my whole aspect of it is, I just hope that people are more open-minded about this whole notion of the history that we don't know. That people, it's okay. I don't say it's okay to question it. It's okay to, want to investigate it further and everything. But people should also try to ask questions about why it is that we don't know the things that we don't know. And like I said, my hope is that people can be more open-minded about these things. And I think importantly to discuss them with one another, whether it's in a book club or, you're if you're at a job and you're passing books around. More of that. I think more of that would be so wonderful and helpful even to us here in this moment. Like I said, I'm not the only one doing this work, but in regards to any other potential historical figure or figures, sort of taking a look at, like I said, Ann Lowe's life trajectory and seeing things that she did that kept her going, that kept her determined after time. Or like I said, in the case of Alice and Portia, in terms of the things that kept them connected with one another, the things that made them different, but yes, made them similar as well. That's my my hope in terms of what I hope people take away.
Wonderful. All right. Well, to all my listeners out there, be sure to pick up your copy of By Her Own Design and look for Piper's second novel, American Daughters, which will be available later this spring. Thank you so much, Piper.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Piper for coming on to the show. To learn more about her, please visit her website at www.piperhuguley.com. I'll be sure to include her information in the show notes for this episode. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.